And I hated to bring such kind of a somber tone to communion, but it ties in with our message today. Not that it's a somber message, but we're looking in 1 Corinthians, still in chapter 9. So if you want to turn there, and while you're turning there, just a reminder that the chili cook-off is going to be Saturday, February 15th, and correct? Yes. I've got the right date. Saturday, February 15th. And do we know how many pots of chili or how many batches of chili we have signed up for now? 12 or 13 different batches of chili? Yeah, how many can we have? Oh, okay. You need three more. We need three more batches? Okay. Okay. I've decided I'm going to bring a batch of chili even, so try my hand. And it's not going to be stag like I normally make. It'll be something different. Hormel, yeah, Hormel. Yeah. You know, my mom's version of homemade chili was Denison's, and then you added some stewed tomatoes, some extra beans, whatever, and that was her homemade chili, which my mom worked full time, so I get that. I understand that. So yeah, put that in your calendars and for that coming up. So if you're in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, want to just preface a little bit because we're going to start taking a look at verse 19 through 23 and then come back to the beginning in verse 9. And the reason is that chapters 8, 9, and 10 are actually together. They're covering a single topic, and there is what was called a chiastic structure of literature, and whether Paul was actually thinking about that or if that's kind of how it just fell into place as he was writing. Often we'll see this in the Psalms, in the Old Testament, and other old ancient writings. Chiastic means, a lot of times when we're making a point or writing an essay, you'll make your point at the beginning, you'll get all your supporting data, and then come back to your point and restate it at the end to remind people of that. But often in this chiastic structure, and again, often it's in the Psalms and it's used poetically, you'll see kind of the main point that is being made is like right in the middle of that essay or poem. It's just right in the center. And then everything kind of supporting that idea or argument is almost in mirror fashion, building up to it and then trailing off of it. Notice we began this section of chapter 8 talking about food sacrificed to idols. And what do we close chapter 10 with? Talking about food sacrificed to idols, right? So there's this like beginning, he's making a point, and then he kind of fills that in and completes it there. So we're going to look at chapter 9, which in verses 19 through 23, which almost fall almost right in the middle of these 73, really about 74 verses that make up this section that Paul's addressing these topics. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 19, Paul says, "Though I am free and I belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law." Now, remember, when he's talking about the law, he's talking about the Old Testament law, which prescribed certain foods, people you could and could not hang out with, very specific holidays and practices that were done. And then, of course, those laws even got added onto. Paul himself was a Pharisee, highly trained in the Jewish law, highly trained in Old Testament Torah, and also in the writings and teachings of the scribes and Pharisees and teachers of his day. So there were just numerous things about that law. So Paul making this statement that I'm not under the law, for a Pharisee to say that is like, no, how can you not be under the law? To say you're not under the law just means I'm outside of God's purview. I'm anti-God in a sense if I'm not under the law. But he goes on to say, I become like one not under the law to those who are not under. So those who are under the law are the Jews that he's ministering to in Corinth. That is, Corinth was a city that was not in Jerusalem. It was not in Israel, but it did have a a colony or a community of Jews there that actually had their own synagogue. Along with that, or in the midst of that, Paul, the greater culture around him were people who were non-Jewish, who lived without that law. They were polytheistic, worshipped a number of gods, and they had multiple temples to do that. So can you imagine coming in, and Paul's trying to reach to both groups, really. He starts at the Jewish synagogue because that's where he is kind of on the same, he understands their language, he understands their thinking, he knows the basis of their theology so that he can reason from that Old Testament idea that they have and go forward from that. But he also has a heart, he knows it's his mission to reach out to what we would call the Gentiles, those who were not under the law. So when he says to those under the law, he's saying to those Jewish people in your community, I live like I am under the law. There were times that Paul had an associate, Timothy, and when Timothy came to work with him, Timothy was not, he had a Jewish mother, but he had a Gentile father. And Timothy had not been circumcised. And Paul prescribes that Timothy should become circumcised so as to be able to minister amongst the Jews without them questioning his character. Because why, if you believe this, why are you not circumcised? So he has them do that. There are things that Paul does when he's hanging out with the Jews to kind of conform to what they do, because he doesn't want them tripping over, in a sense, what he does. He wants them listening to what he says, right? So that they don't just trip over somebody's behavior. I'm sure you can all think, as you look back in your past, perhaps before you were a Christian, of somebody who tried to reach out to you with the gospel, or somebody who presented themselves as a Christian, but something about their lifestyle just said to you, "You're a Christian? Really?" I have a feeling I was probably that to some people, right? Over years ago. Maybe even today. I don't know. People might still go, "Is that what you call a Christian?" I don't know. So he tries to be sensitive to each group that he's with. He said, but I am not, although I myself am not under the law, though as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law. Now Paul clarifies. He says, though I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law. The neat thing is Paul had an understanding of the spirit of the law. He didn't just discount the whole Old Testament, but he could find the spirit and the heart of God in each of those commandments, and therefore what the moral lesson was to be learned from those, and how to carry that forward in his treatment of others. Remember when Jesus was asked, well, what's the most important commandment? Well, you got so many commandments to think about and sort out, and he simply says, well, the first one, which he got right, was that in their minds, that would be the greatest one, is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he said, and the second is like it. He's saying that is equivalent to that, because they would go, there's another one equivalent to that one? Yeah, love your neighbor as yourself. Then they asked, yeah, but who's my neighbor? And then he goes on to tell a story of the Good Samaritan, in which he basically makes a hero of their worst enemy, right? I mean, you talk about flying in the face of opposition. He basically makes the one person in the story they would expect the worst from, and he becomes the hero of the story. He said, well, who's really a neighbor? So he's basically saying, yes, love everyone. And Paul is saying, yeah, to the Jews, I'm going to practice love toward them by following their patterns. To the Gentiles, I'm going to practice love toward them by following their patterns, but I always do it under the banner of practicing love, living by Christ's law and following his example. So as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. So this is the crux of these 3 chapters right here. He's trying to share with them how to have the right perspective toward others. And some of what I shared this morning in our communion is what perspective do we have toward others in the world? Because we tend to do a lot of boxing up. Oh, this person is this. Oh, this person is this. Oh, this person is this. But God's got only 2 boxes. Those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, and those whose names are not. That's it. When it all comes down to it, he doesn't have more categories to sort people into. This is where the rubber meets the road. Paul saw that. Therefore, in 2 Corinthians 5, he makes that point. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. We look at people from God's point of view. I may be head to head with somebody on some point or doctrine or idea, but two things I have to keep in mind. Is their name, well, really single, is their name written in the Lamb's Book of Life? And how do I help them get to that place? How do I stay out of God's way in the midst of what He wants to do, because He wants to accomplish that? It's never up to me to decide that somebody is just not making it in the book. It's not up to me. That's God's perspective. That's His task. I'm never going to look at somebody, well, I've tried everything, and they're just so hard-hearted, I don't know. Paul one time said to his audience, he said, you guys were just like that. You remember? You guys used to be just like that. You guys were never like that, I'm sure. So back to the beginning of chapter 9. We'll start from there. So Paul, in the midst of this, making this greater point, he makes a couple of points about ministry, about serving in ministry, about in the context of how he looks at it. He makes some good points about how we're to view or treat those who are serving in the ministry. And I understand something. I'm not saying this to be self-serving myself. I'm well taken care of and beloved here in our church, and Tina and I are very, very blessed. So I don't do that. I don't bring this up, but here we are in 1 Corinthians at this point, and I think it's important that all of us as Christians have an understanding of the right perspective to have to those who serve in the ministry. So Paul's kind of going to help us shape that while he's making the point of his own behavior. He goes on to say, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Paul had to, from time to time, defend his position as an apostle. He didn't do it to defend his honor or defend his identity. He knew who he was. He knew what his task was. He did it to defend the gospel that he preached. Because if they could discount his apostleship and his authority in that, then they could discount what he was saying. And oftentimes, those who would oppose him would do that. In 2 Corinthians, he refers to a group called the super apostles. Now, he's not talking about Peter or those who came before him. He had high respect for those who were the first of the apostles, those who had spent time with Jesus. But he talks about those who basically make their living preaching and teaching whatever people want to hear, kind of whatever their ears would itch for. And often there were many people who made their living doing that. Just as like we have today, many people who make their living through entertainment, right? By playing roles on TV or whatever it might be, will pay for that entertainment. But in those days, you didn't have broadcast television, right? You didn't have the ability, didn't have a lot of entertainment options. So sometimes that entertainment was simply somebody speaking. And people could make a living if they could do it in such an eloquent and engaging way that they would kind of draw people in. We would think of it possibly like comparing some people to some people who do a lot of either self-help or motivational speaking, right? And they get paid to motivate people to do what they probably already knew they were supposed to do. And in the same way, these people would do that. And they would look down on Paul and say, well, Paul is, he's not like us. He's not as eloquent as we are. He's not as sharp looking as we are. And he would discount that. So don't think it was Peter saying, this, but people would do that. And Corinth was one of those places where he particularly had to defend that. So he's making the point. He said, look at yourselves. Think about where you were and what you were thinking before God sent me into your midst. Have you been changed by my work there? Have you been changed? And then he says, you should know yourselves whether I am sent from God by the impact that ministry has had in your lives. At 2 Corinthians said, you guys are the seal of my apostleship. You are the certification of that. So he's saying, look at the effect of what I do and how does that come out. But he had to do it often not to defend himself, but to defend the gospel that he preached. He goes on to say, don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? He's not complaining about the stinginess of the Corinthians. We'll see later that this is kind of a voluntary place that he has put himself. It's as though he knows their nature enough to not receive anything from them. Have you ever dealt with somebody that you knew you really didn't want a favor from because you'd hear about it? Other people would hear about it, right? It's almost like, no, I don't want to go there. Paul knew that there was this conflict in their minds about whether Paul was really certified, whether he was worth anything, and he didn't want them to come back later and say, we paid you for this. What about that? He isn't complaining that they're necessarily stingy. He's using this situation as an example of his willingness to forego his own rights and freedoms to reach people. He goes on to say, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk? Paul uses examples from life just as Jesus did. And in Paul's day, even a servant or a slave that was assigned to do these menial tasks would benefit from those tasks. He would at least have enough to eat and enough to milk to drink from the flocks that he raised. It was understood that even servants would be taken care of by those that they served. Paul was not opposed to working with his hands to support himself. In Acts chapter 18, it describes Paul's early contact with the Corinthians, in which he goes into Corinth, he begins to minister in the synagogue, he gets kicked out of the synagogue because they don't like what he has to say, he begins work near the synagogue, but prior to that, he's made his way into the city of Corinth, and upon arriving there, he meets a couple, Aquila and Priscilla, who are Jewish, as he is, and we don't know for sure if they're Christians or not at this time, but he begins to work with them in their trade, which is tent making. And that passage says that because Paul had the same trade as they did, or the same business or work, he worked with them. So Paul had this side hustle, so to speak, of tent making. Right? That was just what he did. And Aquila and Priscilla were themselves refugees who had come out of Rome during a persecution. So they had come to Corinth, and they were making a living just sewing up tents, probably repairing tents and doing whatever needed to be done in that regard. And Paul had the skill and ability to do that. So he undertook that work, and that's very likely that, along with help that he received from other churches, is how he sustained or maintained himself while in Corinth. But he's saying, we actually have the right to receive this. However, we have foregone that right voluntarily in order that we might not put any stumbling block in your path. He said, do I say this merely from a human point of view? In other words, am I just the preacher trying to get a raise? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, you don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. And it is in Deuteronomy, right there, it says, while an ox is treading out grain, don't muzzle it. It's nestled in amongst other laws and rules. But the idea was, so Paul is going to go on to make this point. He said, is it about oxen that God is so concerned? Does he think that the guy who owns the ox is actually going to starve it to death while it's working? No, he's going to do it. The idea is this principle, if God is so concerned even about oxen getting what they should have, isn't he also concerned? Again, I love Paul's ability to look into the Old Testament and see the intent of God, to see his heart nestled in that, to say, okay, how do I take that principle and apply it through the lens of love in today's world? So I might say, I don't have any ox, I don't have any grain to tread, so I don't need to worry about that. But the principle is that where there is something being produced, there should be a return on that. And in fact, oftentimes employers will find if they can build in an incentive program for their workers, if they can build that in, they will find that their workers will try to rise to that occasion. And I love even the idea sometimes of like the employee-owned business, right? It's like we're going to go together, we're going to run this business, and we're going to share in its profits and in its losses, right? So that we get that. I had a friend one time. He worked in construction, and he was a subcontractor. And one time he had one of his guys approach him and said, I don't know what next year holds or whatever, but he said, I'm just, if there was any way we could get a raise for next year, that would be awesome, right? If we could do that. This was during kind of a downtime in the economy. And my friend said, I would love to do that for you. He said, are you aware that last year you made more money than I did? He never got a complaint anymore out of that guy. But he made sure that his oxen that were treading that out got their pay even before he got his own. Right? That principle of making sure they got what was coming to them. So surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us. Because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. Here Paul, as he often does, bases his moral reasoning on the spirit, as I said, of the law. He said, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we didn't use this right, he says. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Here's where he's voluntarily saying, no, we won't do that. In 2 Corinthians, Paul points out in his next letter to the same church, he points out, I've never been a burden to you, right? I've never allowed myself to be this burden. He sees himself focused on his purpose in ministry, and he's going to accomplish that purpose. His identity is, I'm an apostle. Look around you. You can see how God is using me in that. I'm content with that. I'm happy whether you see it or not. I know my purpose. I'm here to share the gospel. Whether that nets me money or not, that is my purpose. That's what I'm here to do. I think sometimes as Christians, we have this dichotomy in our thinking. Like, well, there are those whose work is the gospel and the church, and so they do that work. And then there are the rest of us who our work is something else, and so therefore I don't have to think about ministry because somebody else is doing it. In so many very large churches, now so many tasks are staffed out, right? And I get it. Sometimes you just need that. You need that job done. You need it done well. You know it's going to take time. You invest in it. But what we're seeing in churches is sometimes a lessening of volunteerism, right? It's like everything's going to get done by people who get paid to do this. That's how it's done. But the reality is the church still has to move forward with volunteers. And every one of us should see as a part of our purpose serving Christ, right? That should be first and foremost. Now, in my life, I've always, since the time I was in my 20s, I've always prioritized ministry. There are times when I've had to do other work, but I've always done jobs that would allow me the freedom to be involved in ministry and do that. So understanding your purpose and serving that out will save you from being focused on money, because the love of money is not just the root of evil for ministers, right? It's everywhere. It's in all of us. We can all be a little too focused on making that money, and there is always more to make, is there not? He said, don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple? Those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar. Again, he's using the Old Testament. In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. In 1 Timothy 5:17, Paul instructs Timothy that the church will do well to quantifiably, he uses the term double, but think about a quantifiably honor those who serve the church by preaching and teaching. In other words, the church will be blessed by that. The church will have opportunity and will do well to do it. He's instructing Timothy in how the church should operate. The elders who direct, he goes to say in 17 and 18 of 1 Timothy chapter 5, the elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, and he goes on to say, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. Let me ask you a question. Do you listen to Christian radio at all? How many of you listen to Christian radio? How do you really look forward to the time they spend raising money? I think KYCC, we're having our fall friends and family reunion. Doesn't that sound like fun? Oh, turn the dial to something else, right? I'm wondering, should they should, all the stations should have it at the same time so you just can't avoid it, right? Because okay, I'm going over to K-Love now. Over here. Oh, I'll go back here. We never like that aspect of being reminded, about money. It's funny how we are just kind of that way in our world. It's like, oh, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to hear about what they need. I can't be a part of it. But yet, we appreciate the work they do, right? We love the work they do. We appreciate it. We enjoy it. But when they're having to turn the wheel, wouldn't it be awesome if ministries never had to do that? If they never had to do that. I've had worked with nonprofits long enough to know that the church is in a very special place. We don't pass a plate here, but we get basically to receive an offering from people weekly, right? You're weekly here, you're thinking about it, or nowadays you set up online regular. We have a lot of people whose training is already, I'm going to tithe, I'm going to give 1/10 of my income to the Lord, that's what I'm going to do. So we have that advantage. It's those parachurch organizations and other organizations that have to go, hey, have you thought of us over here? Hey, we're over here. We love that they're there. We love what they're doing. But at the same time, we get a little annoyed when they take up our time to do it. Isn't it? It's just an attitude. I have it. I mean, I listen. Caleb, okay, they're raising money again. Let's turn to the other station. I've heard enough of this. No, I do not want your t-shirt. Thank you very much. But they're not doing it just to get more money. They're doing it with a sense of purpose. They're doing it with a sense of purpose. They could put commercials on there. They could put other stuff, all that stuff. They could sell that time to somebody. But instead, they feel very committed to making sure that the gospel is what you hear and the music about the gospel is what you hear when you turn to that station, not just a commercial. So I know for them, because I've known enough missionaries, worked with enough missionaries, and I ask them, what's your least favorite part of this job? Raising money. Right? Sometimes they have fancy names. Oh, deputation. This is deputation. Basically, you're raising money, right? Yes, that's what I'm doing. We're raising partners. You're getting money, right? Yeah, that's what we're doing. And what I love is their commitment to it, right? Here's Paul. He's really conveying, this is why I do what I do. That even though you don't pay me for it, I'm willing to do this because I see the world in two categories, those whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life and those whose names are not. I don't see it as those who pay me and those who won't. I see it in this category. That's the perspective that I have. Let me give you some thoughts from a church or donor's perspective. You can purchase or pay for or remunerate somebody for their time. You can even pay more perhaps and get greater talents, but you can never buy character or motivation. Right? You never buy character or motivation. Like the Macedonians, because Paul refers to these Macedonians who came and gave him some support in 2 Corinthians. So I forgot to tell you that, but I'll just tell you that now. Like the Macedonians, do not see yourself as paying for services rendered to you. Well, I like that sermon. I think I'll give a little something toward that. Well, that helped me. I'll go ahead and do that. The mature Christian actually invests instead in building the kingdom. And they see if that's how God's building the kingdom. So here is Paul ministering in Corinth, which is it's not a poor city. He's ministering in Corinth and he's not taking money for his support. He's making tents. And here come some Christians from Macedonia making the journey with money to give to Paul so that he'll be supported. Right? I think what a greater attitude to have. Paul, you're building the kingdom. We want to help you with that. I love to think whenever we have a speaker come in and we maybe take an offering for them or we give them an honorarium, I don't think of it as, well, what was that worth? What should we pay for that? What was that worth? I don't know. That probably wasn't worth what a box seat would be worth at a game. What would it cost if I went to a concert and spent that much time? No, we go, what can we invest and how can we send them to the next place? How can we invest in what God's doing through them so that you see it not as purchasing that, well, we've hired that person to do that. Think about this. Someone was very likely helping you to understand the gospel long before you were helping to support them. I know the pastor who reached out to me when I was a teenager, I hadn't given him a dime. And it was probably some time before he ever saw any money out of me after he had invested hours in me. I remember having this question come up one time as I was talking to somebody, not on my board, not on the board here at the church, but just a board member of a church, and we were talking about salaries. And he said, I want to ask you a question. He said, what do you think? What do you think is like the most a pastor should make? Like in our area, what's think the most? And I said, well, this man ran his own business. I said, well, what's the most you should make? He couldn't give me a number. Well, that all depends on what jobs come in. I said, right. But in your mind, you have a ceiling for that person. Like what you think would be morally right, and anything beyond that must be immoral. But why is it your income is never like moral only up to a point and then immoral after that? Right? I might think about how you're getting your money, but I'm not going to try to put a lid on how much you make, right? God hasn't put a lid on you. So I said, just think about it. What do you think about that? And I'll share this with you. If you feel that ministers or ministries should be doing what they do for free, it's very likely that for you, they are. You've never been denied service. You've never been denied the Word of God. You've never been denied the truth or help or assistance or prayer because of whether you gave or not. So very likely you are receiving it for free. Paul goes on to say, and then we'll look at his perspective, but I've not used any of these rights, and I'm not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast. I love how that word boast, we go, oh, Paul, boastful Paul. Actually, what he's saying is, I don't want anybody denying me of the hope that I have because of this opportunity. Right? I have an opportunity to serve. There's a hope that I have in God's blessing because of that. I'm not going to let anybody deny me that in exchange for their ability to say, okay, well, we paid you, Paul, there. He said, I'm not going to let you deny me of that. I do not want anyone to give to this church unless you see it as a blessing and an opportunity to do so. This is just an opportunity to give. Not like, okay, well, we've been going this long. This should be, let's see, how much should a service, let's see, how much per service should we pay? What should we do? No, but just an opportunity to give to God and to give it joyfully. God loves joyful givers. He loves it when that happens. Yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, he says, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. What a perspective. It's like I don't do it because it makes me money like these other speakers that go around with their self-help stuff or whatever they do. He said, I'm compelled to do this. You leave me in rags, poverty, with nothing to eat, and I'll be on the corner, right? I'll find a way to share the gospel with people. He showed up in Corinth with nobody promising him a job, nobody saying, hey, Paul, we got a church, we got a position open. Nothing. He shows up, and what does he bring? His tools to make tents. He's ready to go. And he starts sowing a very resisted message in the synagogue there. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast. I'm compelled, he said. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I'm missing the rest of my notes, but that doesn't mean you don't get the rest of the sermon. Paul's attitude is basically, this is who I am. This is my purpose. If you choose to be a part of that, that's fine, but I'm going to do it either way because it's my task to minister the gospel. So I want to just share a few things with you that I believe are valuable, especially if anybody's here thinking, I feel like God might be calling me into ministry, especially like vocational ministry. Like I like that work that a pastor does, or I like that teaching and Bible study. So let me tell you something, first of all. Most teaching and Bible study work and work done in churches today is done by volunteers, right? So there aren't many people who get paid to do the ministry. You might have been in a church setting where you saw lots of staff and other stuff, but that's still a small percentage of that. And as it should be, we should be quite willing to make our time available, quite willing to be a part of that. So most of the work you do will not be what you get paid for. Most churches are small churches, pastored by pastors who are what we call bivocational. That is, they pastor the church and they have another job. And I've had people say when I was in that position, so you pastor part-time? No. No. My phone's always connected, right? I'm always praying, always waiting on God for a message. But so I'm never part-time at this task, but sometimes I work part-time at other tasks, right? And over the years, I've done that many times. When God when the supply here is diminished or the church is diminished, I go out. When I was working in Christian school and Christian education, believe me, Christian school teachers are not overpaid. They're not that. I know that's private school. They must be making a fortune down there. They're not overpaid. But so I can remember a time when basically I was working 5 days a week in the school, and then Saturday I would go work at the lumber yard. So I was working 6 days a week to support that work because I felt called to it. I felt a sense of purpose in it. And part of our task was I wanted to keep it within range for the students we had. I had a lot of students in my class that were not from wealthy families. They were from families who were working hard to make it work themselves. So I was willing to do that. I did that because of purpose and identity. I knew this is what God wanted me to do, and that's what I was going to do. So I headed out and did that. Even here at pastoring the church, there have been times when while I've done this, I've remodeled houses, I've built a house, I've done things that I needed to do to supplement our income during that time. So I entered full-time Christian ministry just a little over 42 years ago. What I call full-time, where that's my vocation, and then if I have to supplement, I do that. And I've done supplement. During that time, Tina spent about 30 years working in banking and helping to support us, basically providing the benefits that we needed so that we would not be too much of a burden to the church. And it's not because the church was stingy, it's just the church was small. That's a reality. So I just tell, when I'm talking to people thinking about going in the ministry, I said, you're going into a task. You're not going into a position. So I don't think that that's going to happen. And be prepared to be cheerfully bivocational. Cheerfully bivocational. And to find purpose in that. When I was in church, I was in San Andreas. If you'd ask people, do you know Vernon Mayhall? You know how most people in town knew him? He was the guy who drove their school bus. That's how they knew him. And when he was on the school bus, he was taking advantage of every opportunity to connect with kids and build relationships. And when he started then working in the community and doing youth work, he already had this network. He saw it as opportunity, and he just took it, right? He never said, oh, one day I'll be a real preacher. He just went at it. Pastor Keith Chilson, who came along later, you know how most people would remember Keith Chilson in San Andreas? Oh, he was a really friendly guy working in the hardware department at Treat's store. Right? That's who he was. How they saw him, and the connections and the contacts he did through that. While he was pastoring this church, and he helped build the church. Basically, the building, we put up a new building. He built his own home for his family. All that time while he's pastoring this church, doing it. So I tell people, don't think that this is some kind of glamorous work that we all get paid this top dollar. A lot of people who are in that role of ministry even today, many people who are in full-time ministry, were not in that for the whole time. They were very busy, often bivocationally, to get to that place and working just at what God gave them to do. So don't think that that's always that way. Be prepared to do it. And I tell people this all the time when they're between opportunities, especially men when they, I've been laid off here, laid off there. I said, well, you may not always have a job, but there's always work to be done. Always work to be done. Can I share one more story with you? Do we have time for one more short story? Is it lunchtime? Are you guys stomach growling? So my brother was pastoring the church here before I was. He was one of the founding pastors here back in probably 1978, and he was bivocational for a time as they were getting the school. There were a lot of times when we were working, full time at the school, and he was working part time as a pastor to kind of help support that. So he helped build that up and was happy and cheerful when he needed to go work and did that bivocationally. But so he learned some skills. He learned some construction skills and other things. When he went into the mission field, 1990. First place that he and Sherry went with their two kids, Johnny and Alex. Johnny and Angela. Johnny's wife is Alex. Johnny's sister Angela. When they first went into missions work, they went to the Youth with a Mission base in Hawaii. And they were going to go through what they call a discipleship training school, which everybody has to go through that before they can work in the organization as full-time missionaries. Their goal was to be full-time missionaries working with Youth with a Mission, and they would go through this discipleship training schools. They packed up baggage, all that, headed over there to Hawaii, and when they got there, they found out that their youngest, Angela, was too young to be in the child care program, so John and Sherry could not go through the discipleship training school. So they left behind their job, their church, their house, everything, moved over to Hawaii, got onto the base, and had raised support and all that, and they couldn't get started in this discipleship training school. So it was kind of frustrating for him. But they said, but what other skills do you have? John said, well, I've done some construction work. Oh, do you know how to do electrical work? John said, yeah, I've done electrical work. He said, okay. Well, we've got a program you can be a part of here, and so you'll be just an underpaid slave working for us, doing maintenance on buildings. So they sent him to this house on campus. It was fairly nice, one of the larger homes on campus, to do some wiring. This was a campus. Oftentimes, Youth with a Mission would end up with a facility that was kind of unused and old, and they would kind of either purchase it or sometimes had them donated to them to form these campuses. So this was a building that needed some work. So he's in there doing this wiring, and he hears a voice while he's doing the wiring. Hey, how you doing? And he goes, what? Well, I'm just here doing some wiring. And turns out that the gentleman's house that he was working on was a gentleman by the name of Loren Cunningham. And Loren Cunningham was the founder of Youth with a Mission. He was like the head guy, the last guy you would expect to just run into while you're wiring a house, right? So John's, doing that. He gets into conversation with Loren, and they're talking about ministry, and they're talking about mission. And Loren's like, well, what do you hope to do? What do you want to do? He said, oh, my dream would be to be like on a mercy ship or something. I just have this vision that we're supposed to be in the islands doing some work, and I just feel like that's where we're supposed to be. And Loren Cunningham said, hey, he said, you were a pastor, right? He said, yeah, for a number of years. He goes, we have a special mission. This is a historic mission that we're going to be taking. The only country Youth with a Mission has not worked in, right, is Pitcairn's Island. It's one of the smallest countries in the world. It's a tiny little country. It's the island upon which the Bounty landed, right? And the crew of the Bounty started that colony there. So these are descendants that live there of the Bounty that was from the mutiny on the Bounty. So he said, we're the last country for it to go to. He said, we're taking this mercy ship, the Pacific Ruby, with some assistance and some medical supplies and other things, and we're going to sail out there, and we're going to. This is historic. This will be us reaching the final unreached nation by Youth with a Mission. I'd like you to go with us as a pastor. You see, God has a plan. God has a purpose for you. Nobody can thwart it. Nobody can undermine it. No, it's in nobody's hands. It's in nobody's hands other than God's. And so I want to just encourage you, as you think about giving, you think about people in ministry, remember that it's not as simple as just maybe this person has a job and they make so much money. But think about, as you give, there's opportunity to just continue to build the kingdom and to build into the lives of those who feel such a calling and purpose, as Paul did, to reach out to a world that is in need of that good news of Jesus Christ. Would you bow your heads with me? Father, I thank you that you put it in Paul's heart to do whatever was necessary to reach whomever you put in front of him. And I ask, Lord, that we could have that same heart. Sometimes our vision gets small. We're content with just the smiling faces we see on a Sunday morning. We're happy with our little family of believers in our gathering. That's great. But Lord, you have vision for such a big family. You want a full table at the wedding supper of the Lamb. You want a book of life that is just full to overflowing with names who have come to know you. Father, I thank you for those men in my life who worked often underpaid or unpaid, and the impact that they had on me. And I ask you, Lord, to help us as your servants to be focused on the mission and the purpose you have for us. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. God bless you.